the capitalist system that we live in. It is a way for, because we don't actually have a justice system. We have a capitalist system that determines who gets punished and who does not. And because it's capitalism, that means it is based on race, and it is based on class, and it's based on gender. And these are just some of the ways. The same thing with our education system. We don't have an education system. We have a capitalist system that determines who gets access to education and who does not. And Black people.
Legislation that was put up 27 years ago. Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, voted for it. Chuck Schumer, Senate Majority Leader, voted for it, right? So we could talk about all of the ways that it did really awful things policy-wise. $10 billion in subsidies to expand state prisons, cut off Pell Grants for people, 3-strike rules, let 13-year-olds be tried as adults, 60 new death penalty offenses, the cops office, which we're still fighting right now, which puts police in schools. All of that is really important, but when we talk about the direct impact right now, it's that it turned Joe Biden in his floor speech talked about how root causes didn't matter. If you go back and watch the floor speech that Biden gave when he was passing legislation, he said, doesn't matter that folks didn't have what they needed. It doesn't matter that we created the system that means that they don't have what they needed. Right now, we have to protect ourselves. And so there was a lack of responsibility on the part of the system that was put on people.
And so one of the things that we're doing, and see, when you talk about abolition is actually doing the work and that we're actually doing things, we're fighting for voting rights for our brothers and sisters in prison in our state. Like, that's what we're fighting for right now. We got a bill pending in our state legislature that will re-enfranchise our brothers and sisters that are behind the wall, right? Our neighbors that are behind the fence, because their vote matters too, right? Like, they need to be able to decide who's going to be on the school board for their babies, where the park's going to be in their neighborhoods. And without a right to vote, they don't have a voice in those matters. So we see that as empowering our people to then go out and do participatory democracy, right? Okay, now
are things happening. That work is happening all over the place. A lot of people think that the work that we're talking about is idealistic and far away, and like somebody, one day can maybe think about doing this if we put our heads together, and they don't realize that people are already building, people are already writing the legislation, people have the draft legislation, people have been developing these praxis and, philosophies and such over decades.
Because even when I think about restorative justice, I think the word that people miss is that accountability is included in that, but not the punishment. So it's not saying that we excuse what happened, but what we're saying is that when we hold someone accountable, we want to also offer them the resources to help themselves.
Yes.
And so I think
highlights how inhumane the system is, and it permeates throughout. It permeates in how police are directly linked to catching folks and bringing them to this, new modern slavery system, and how they dehumanize us in the process, how we dehumanize each other and replicate the prison industrial complex, the justice system, that's so unjust, right? We replicate the prison, the way that we imprison each other, the way that we shun each other, the way that we punish each other.
A connection to surveillance, and the way surveillance impacts young people. So I spoke earlier about ShotSpotter, the campaign that I'm working on, these like microphones that are primarily in Black and brown neighborhoods in Chicago. ShotSpotter microphones are in over 120 cities right now. And so, what that looks like when these microphones are in our neighborhoods, they're also near our schools. And
we
so
already know we need a different approach to safety in our schools. These approaches can be different, right? It can be from culturally and gender informing educators and mental health professionals and education in our schools, to restorative justice practices, increasing access to art, culture, education, and students in low-income neighborhoods. Like, these are the things that we are talking about. A lot of people like to say, like, oh, these groups are just talking about police and getting them out, but what are we doing? We are bringing up what we should do and what we need. Like we're not only telling you that what we need to get out, but we already are telling you the solutions that the community are.
Something that comes up for me just listening to you now, that so often, you know, the hesitation or the discouragement for engaging with law enforcement comes from an abundance of concern for the assailant, you know, the loved one, the person who's done us harm, which is part of why Black and brown women have such complicated relationships. Part of the reason that we have such a complicated relationship to engaging with law enforcement, that we want to oftentimes protect people who've done us harm. But what you've mentioned is that it isn't simply the potential harm that could face, because you might not care if they come kill him, quite frankly, you know, depending on what's happened to you. But this is not necessarily about protecting the guilty party from harm or what comes of engaging with the system of law enforcement. It's what may happen to you as a survivor. Will you be believed? Will you be arrested?
We need to be building up the skills and resources of our people to be able to be that good friend who can be the person that folks can go to for safety, right? And so that looks like small experiments. It looks like
what Vala did in the time and still now, like, answered legitimate call for like healing intergenerational trauma, healing interpersonal violence, things that the feminist movement was really calling for, but with a carceral response, which is violence, you know, within and of itself. And
right. So ICE essentially are the paper police, right? They're not out there in a situation where they're trying to, quote unquote, as much as they say that they do, stop crime. Absolutely not. These are paper tigers, paper police that cause havoc in our communities. They home raid, separate our families, and even in certain situations, like 21 Savage, I think in 2019, starting to do joint operations with police that end up in certain cases fatally also. So that's what they are. They're a deportation force that causes havoc in our community.
You know, when we see, like Brittany was saying, when we see Indigenous people, we see immigrants come here from other places and they set down roots and they start creating, you know, family, and they start creating community. That is concerning to these folks because in their minds, it says they're taking from us, versus the perspective of having the consciousness that says when people are coming here and they are building a community, that's going to naturally uplift every other community, because you bring good, you add good. And it really is something that I think on a basic level, when you all said, you know, why can't we move freely? Well, we were brought here to be slaves. So this country has never reconciled and said, like, this wasn't a good idea for us. This country has never said, like, you know, slavery wasn't really like the best thing for us. And until that, like, as a culture becomes the American way, this will continue to be a part of the ethos that people subscribe to make themselves feel American. And that's the thing. It's not even.
I know immigration is very personal to me, just based on my family. They crossed over, right, you know, and some family members are still have no papers and stuff like that. And it's like that. It's people need to understand the fear, you know, the fear of trying to build a life, a family, always looking over your shoulder, right? And not necessarily looking at your shoulder for, you know, a cop or whatever, you know, all that also entails violence, you know, all those things, right? But being taken away from your family, right? And sent somewhere where either you ran away from because of violence, because of poverty, or you getting sent somewhere because, you know.
So I think part of it is we started with poly-ed, right? Like we didn't just jump into the PMAs. We started with the political education process first. So we partnered with our local orgs to really map out what that curriculum would look like. And so we had 4 big units, right? We had one on the crime bill. We had one on what safety is and like defining safety outside of caging and policing. We had one on what is participatory democracy, just breaking that down, defining democracy as we know it or know it, because I have a whole critique that I won't get into now, defining participatory democracy. And then just talking through like what civics is, right? Like how does government actually work right now? and why this process is different. So we did like really intensive like sessions with folks on that. Like we did a train the trainer to get folks ready, but also like they took it back to their members to prepare them for then having People's Movement Assembly. So there was kind of a flow. And I think that definitely helped everyone feel, you know, equipped and ready to be like, oh, this is what we're doing together. This is why. And it gave us a chance to kind of, you know, repetition is key. So it gave us a chance to really make sure that everybody's on the same page and understood it, because we're creating this as we go, like it's an experiment and trying new things out as we see fit. So that's the political education, I think, was key in making sure that we kind of have the right grounding to get all this work.
Obviously, the experience of incarceration, like being caged, like you said, Kendrick, is terrible. You're also pulled away from your community, right? And then you're excluded from the process of making any decisions that impact the community that you come from, right? So you're not able to actually do anything about what's happening back home while you're away, right? And to get even more specific about like the states that we're working with, right? In California, you have to serve a full prison sentence before you can have your rights restored, right? The same is true in Illinois. The same is true in North Carolina. And there's even stuff that it can follow you in certain states after your like sentence is completed. Because even getting into like what sentencing means, there's going home, then there's parole, and then there's probation, right? So there's all these other forms of supervision that continue even after you're not inside of the prison walls. And even like, you're still trying not to get caught up and avoid having that stuff all snatched away from you and going back into prison and losing your rights all over again, right? So it's an incredibly difficult process even when you're out to get the rights restored, if that's even available in the state that you live in, right? So it's like all these different ways to keep our folks excluded from the process, right? It's social and it's civil death, in addition to all of the physical suffering that people have to endure.
There's very few orgs that have the framing that y'all do, the what is it called, like philosophy and praxis that y'all have, because y'all are from us, right? And have the political education that says, you know, we make sure that we credit where credit is due, and we participate, make sure that everybody, even it's baked into the work that y'all are doing right now, making sure everybody can participate, even those who society throws away, right? And then when that's at the center of our things, and even when we're talking about government, national government, you know, and even like local, there are fights and such, and there's a lot of things that we have to wade through. So almost every little piece of this process that is being condensed was like, how do you get in? Getting people to call you back and getting people to email you back, not ignore you or usurp, you know, what the actual protocol is supposed to be. And then, you know, just to be real, you got a lot of fuck shit and you got to deal with it and wade through it. So, you know, I'm beyond grateful, you know, especially with my folks in prison, for the work y'all are doing.